A question that I'm seeing on more and more channels these days, including Park Rose Permaculture and the psychiatrist Dr. Russell Razak, is why is the current U.S. administration so cruel? And why are their supporters so cruel? But it's not just how cruel they are, it's how they bond over cruelty. The more cruel they are to outgroups, the more they seem to love each other. In other words, cruelty has become Maga's love language. So in today's episode, I'll explore what's behind this hate bonding so people, communities, and especially cities can intervene before it spirals into uncontrolled and widespread violence. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Let's start with how people bond in general. As I pointed out in a recent episode, this actually starts in infancy. Whenever our caregivers cuddled us, our bodies produced a warm, nurturing boost of oxytocin. That's the molecule pictured here. This is a powerful hormone and neurotransmitter that shapes our attachment throughout our lives. And at some point, probably in our infancy, most of us gained a second layer of attachment, which is not only to run to our caregivers, but also to run to them for protection from strangers. So we learned to pair stranger danger with running to safety. And it's my thesis, still unproven, that oxytocin works both ways. That is to say, not only does cuddling with caregivers give you a boost of oxytocin, but so does having a negative reaction to strangers and outgroups. Now, I did a little digging, and it turns out there's some research that's starting to support at least part of this. In a 2011 study, they found that oxytocin promotes human ethnocentrism. They looked at how long it took for Dutch men to come up with positive and negative words describing a list of names. One list had Dutch surnames, another had German surnames, and a third had Arab surnames. So they had them do this under the influence of a dose of oxytocin sprayed into their nose and the influence of a placebo. When they compared the two, they found that the oxytocin increased in-group regard, so the good names being paired with the Dutch surnames, and also increased out-group disregard, the negative words associated with Arab surnames, in the case of the Dutch male subjects. So we're about halfway there. We know that oxytocin can strengthen our bonds to our in-group and can also make us feel more hostility toward out-groups. What I'm not aware of yet is research that says that hostility toward out-groups gives us a stronger feeling of being bound to our in-group, and the literature search continues, but I think we've all experienced hate bonding in daily life, whether it's just complaining about the weather, with semi-strangers at a bus stop, complaining about a boss or an instructor, with coworkers or classmates. We've all bonded a little bit over disparaging some outsider, which is all not terribly harmful until it becomes bullying, or worse, spirals into mass hysteria. But I've actually been in a community where we had rival churches leading prayer circles to have the Almighty come down and smite members of the competing church. These were all Christians, but they had formed such tight in-groups that the only way to bond any tighter to one another was to start disparaging outsiders and eventually wishing them harm. Of course, this can spiral into violence at scale, genocides, and so forth. But it doesn't help that oligarchs, people who own nearly everything, use demagogues to divide potential opponents and recruit supporters. And just for reference, I took a look at the Wikipedia entry for racial views of Donald Trump. And the thing that caught my eye is that the article may be too long to read and navigate comfortably. And the external links went to 479 references. So it's just a really, really long list. And when you stop to read the examples, many of them are horrific. These were not just disparaging outgroups of various sorts, but ways in which he was able to bond with his base. This was his love language with Maga. And of course, this has led to where we are today, where there's these immigration sweeps that are patently unjust. They have no due process. 47% of the detainees have no prior arrests or convictions. 95% of them have no history of violence whatsoever. The detentions are brutal, involving physical assault, the complete destruction of families, and damage to property. And even with all that, it's still ineffective. For example, as reported in the Washington Post, in July of this year, the current administration has deported 14,700 people a month on average, compared to 36,000 people a month on average in 2013 under Obama. In other words, less than half as many deportations overall as Obama, where due process was observed and there were no giant concentration camps abroad and at home. It's also been catastrophic for the country as a whole, causing widespread trauma, further mistrust of the government, and as I think we'll see in the coming months, a significant disruption to our food system that will only deepen our already too great food insecurity. This is a very dark path that can only end in slavery and genocide, and I will be touching on these topics from the perspective of urban permaculture in coming episodes. So to answer the question, why is Maga so cruel? It's their love language. And sometimes, unfortunately, yours and mine too, because oxytocin. And of course, this raises the uncomfortable question as to whether the rest of us could fall down an equally dark path. There are, of course, other social and psychological factors at play, as Dr. Razak has mentioned. But I think the biggest difference is that billions and billions of dollars have been spent over the years perverting human attachment for political and financial gain, dividing people against each other in the country. So the real question is, how do we keep a lid on the hate bonding that's built into every person? Let's start at the individual level. What can you and I do to stop Maga hate bonding before it spirals into something much worse? There's really three forms of resistance: hot, cold, and warm. Hot resistance is what it sounds like: getting angry, arguing, insulting, maybe even fact-checking with a giant avalanche of references. Cold resistance is where you abruptly cut contact entirely. You block, unfriend, or maybe even just ghost them so that you have no further contact at all. The problem with hot and cold resistance is that it breaks your bond with them and sends them back to their Maga peers and hardens them together against you. So we want to use warm resistance. Now, I'm certainly no expert in this. I'm mostly focused on urban design. Now, as it happens, I had some printed resources lying around. This is a pamphlet from the Southern Poverty Law Center, a couple of pamphlets. And I found that they actually offer them for free online. This pamphlet, Speak Up, Responding to Everyday Bigotry, is wonderful. It covers so many different scenarios in a very useful format where there's a story and then a what would you do section that gives you some advice. One of the ones that I thought was truly amazing was right near the front. This is a woman fielding a backhanded compliment that made her feel angry and embarrassed at the same time, and how she found a way to clearly draw her boundaries and make herself understood in a respectful way that led to growth on the part of the other person. Really excellent stuff. And for your convenience, I've linked it in the description below. There's a lot of nuance, but in situations where you're really close to the person, it can be just shocking when you hear the hate speech coming out of nowhere. In these situations, I'd like you to consider the possibility that they've been using the hate speech as their love language with their peers, and they've momentarily forgotten themselves with you and are using the same language with you, maybe even unconsciously. In these situations, among the many others in the pamphlets, what helps is finding the common ground that has already bonded them to you before the conversation. Setting a boundary. This could be as simple as saying, hey, look, in my house, I don't like to insult any groups of people, and we don't talk about hurting people. It could be reflecting with empathy, saying, hey, when you say this is the effect it has on me, or this is what I hear, or it's very upsetting because. Engaging with curiosity, hey, I really didn't expect to hear that from you. Where are you getting this from? Or fact-checking things together with them rather than just clobbering them with references. Can you see how this is not easy? It takes a lot of patience and skill, and you're competing with billions of dollars of paid influence, which is why it's a really good idea as much as possible to not face these situations alone. That's why SPLC has released a community resource guide, 10 Ways to Fight Hate, that I think is pretty helpful, where the premise is how to organize to resist a hate group coming to town and having a big public event. That's pretty good stuff. But once again, whether as an individual or as a community, warm but assertive and clear resistance is the order of the day. Now, what about larger scale? What can cities do to overcome hate bonding? Now, urban design has triumphed in the past over even medical problems. In 1854, there was a cholera epidemic in London that was beyond the ability of doctors to treat or cure, until a physician named John Snow used cluster analysis of the fatalities to link them to a contaminated water source. City design in the form of water sanitation turned out to be the key to preventing cholera and has been the main way that it's prevented to this day. So the question is, could city design also limit the extent and harms of hate bonding? Now, how could they do that? Well, simply by bringing people together. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "The ability to work together to understand each other will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact." Creating that fact of contact is the miracle of cities. For what are cities but a way to organize space for harmony in groups that are too big for individual bonds? As a project to bring large numbers of people together, cities have been doing this for 10,000 years. And I touched on the mechanisms that cities use to transcend individual bonds in episode 144. Even in modern times, cities have been designed specifically to harmonize a population with amazing results. In 1962, 75% of the population of Singapore lived in slums that were prone to fires and three-way race riots. In 1965, the new government launched a social housing policy that guaranteed housing as a human right to everyone, and by 2025, 80% of the population lives in very high amenity social housing, and Singapore enjoys a level of wealth and cohesion vastly beyond that of the United States today. Maybe you've seen the movie Crazy Rich Asians, which was in Singapore. And in the West, social housing and high public amenities have been a fact of life in cities like Vienna for over 100 years, resulting in Vienna being named many times by Mercer, the BBC, the Monocle, The Economist, and other papers as the #1 most livable city in Europe. And although France has long been plagued with inequality in their banlieues, the low-income suburbs around some of their cities, especially Paris, in 2020 they passed a law mandating inclusionary housing in all areas of all cities above a certain size, and are slowly digging their way out of a pretty horrible social situation. So here's a summary of how cities can prevent hate bonding. Neighborhood design can build strong ties through quality, mixed-income housing that meets the needs of a wide swath of humanity. These need to be designed to be walkable and mixed use, meaning that homes, shops, cafes, some offices are all within walking distance. And neighborhoods should have common areas, such as playgrounds and natural and edible landscaping. Towns can link wider networks of people through expanded commons, such as public transit, parks, and museums, as well as activities such as festivals, parades, and so forth. And at the scale of a whole city, they can build partnerships between organizations that might not otherwise work together. This would be educational, cultural, industrial, media, as well as the physical infrastructure, high-speed rail, and even public services such as the weather service. And at this scale, we can even deal with the fact that many people in cities today get completely separated from nature and start to hate bond against nature. If you've ever lived in the country and had somebody who's lived in a city their whole lives come and visit, you know what I'm talking about. A butterfly lands on their shoulder and they're flipping out because they don't know what it is. This is why cities need to engage in large-scale wild habitat restoration, both within their boundaries and in their surrounding bioregion, so that we don't hate bond against nature. Now, if you want to learn more about any of the topics I've talked about today, I put them in a playlist, which you can access right here. And if you have a moment, be sure to check out our publications in the links in the description below this video. If you happen to see that subscribe button, be sure to click it so you don't miss out on more deep dives like this. And as always, I owe a tremendous thanks to the patrons for supporting this channel. You are much appreciated. Take care, stay green, see you next time.